daughter, Sophia, and my 8-year-old son, David, who I love dearly, but who we have gone through this process of them having an immigrant family as parents and us trying to understand the concept of immigration and mental health, and for them to be in a tricultural environment has been an interesting journey that I didn't know was going to happen 25 years ago when I moved here. So without further ado, let me share my screen so that we can ground this conversation today. And, for everybody here, what we will be doing today is we're going to talk a little bit about the cross-section of trauma and crisis and how that affects our Latinx community, and specifically, our refugee and immigrant community. So let me put my screen up here. So, when we're working with refugees and immigrants, one of the biggest things is our life experience is so different than everybody else, right? Our brains had been created for us to be able to understand how to survive, how to thrive, how to relate to each other. The difference with us and the rest of the world is refugees and immigrants were created to do all of these life skills and have a life experience in their own country. However, all of a sudden, because of different experiences, when we think about refugees, most of them are forced to leave their home. And when we think about immigrants, a lot of us had the opportunity to choose to come to the US. What happens with this is once we make that move, depending on what the reason that we're moving to the US, one of the things that happen is we experience sometimes traumatic events that we were not supposed to experience, or that we were not prepared to experience, or we go through situations where they're so stressful, but we're able to thrive and overcome them. So I always like to start my presentation by making a big difference between what trauma is and a stressful situation is. And these two things really affect the way not only that we perceive the world, but the way that we relate as a community, and specifically, when you're thinking about being in a different country and then reframing the way that you were created to be. So a traumatic event is, I love this definition from Dr. Peter Levine, because I think it encompasses everything. So a traumatic event happens when something happens and it's too much, too fast, too soon, too little, too long. Now, when we're thinking about refugees and immigrants, this is what happens to us when we move here, regardless of the reason why we move here. We come to a different country. We are experiencing a culture shock, regardless of where we're coming from. But not only that, but we are embracing everything. It's coming fast. It's coming soon. We have skills, but they're not enough, or they're too little or too much. And all of those things really encompass our experience here. And I'll talk a little bit about how that impacts generations to come. Our brain is, has been created to experience stressful situations. And stressful situations are situations that causes us fear and sadness, but they're manageable. I talk a lot about this when I am even talking about my own experience, because when I moved over here, I was single. I had my bachelor's degree in psychology. I came in here as an international student. I live on campus. I work at the library. And the US was really a playground for me, right? I had the opportunity to have a scholarship that provided all of these. And then halfway through my master's degree, I met my husband. And he grew up here. He had a credit life. And he had all of these skills that I didn't really have. And that union really provided me the opportunity to develop the rest of my life. So even though immigrated here was stressful for me, there were not that many situations that I will consider were a traumatic experience, because there were all of these social things that really provided me the opportunity to adjust and acculturate into this country. So let's talk a little bit about the brain. I am going to give you like a sweet 5-minute presentation on the brain. After you finish here, you're going to be totally qualified to talk about this. But, our brain is created by 3 important parts. So we have, and Dr. Siegel is the person that presents about this. So our brain has 3 huge parts. Our first part is our reptilian brain, or what we talk about being our control system that has all of our survival skills. It has all the regulation, is the part of our brain that was created at the very beginning when conception happens. And then we have another part of our brain that is the limbic system. And this part of our brain actually is the one that has to do with relationships, being able to connect with other emotions. All of that part is in this part of our brain. And then we have our prefrontal cortex. Our prefrontal cortex is our logical brain. It connects us with all of the outer world. It allows us to connect with the future, with logical thinking. Right here in the middle of our brain, we have the neocortex, and that part of our brain has to do with memory, senses, and experiences. So I bet you're wondering, why am I talking about this? The reason what I'm talking about this is when we are born, our culture, our country, our experience really creates all of these experiences. I always joke with people because after I have my daughter, and I remember, the car seat in the car and trying to figure out how to maneuver, being a working mom and working here. I was a mess. Sophia was born in July, and January was a nightmare for me. I didn't know how to dress her. It was so warm, and I always felt like she was probably going to get a heat stroke. Most of the time, our brain is created to face parenting, to face everyday life skills based on what we learn from our own countries. Now, when I went to a city for the first time with Sophia, I was a machine, in New York or in San Francisco. I will put the stroller under my arm. I'll have Sophia on my other hand. I will have my purse. And my husband was lost. He didn't know what to do without a car. Well, the reason of that is when we are in a situation when we have to face something, our brain goes into automatic and we go into learning the skills that we have that allows us to do everyday tasks. Now, one important thing that I want to mention is when we are in a situation when we don't have that group of people that support us, or we don't know how to read social cues, which happens a lot when we first come into this country. We're totally capable of doing that in our own environment, but once we immigrate here, there is a part of this social environment that we have to do. There is a lot of learning that happens with learning a new language and being able to understand that. And all of the memories, that I was talking in the neocortex, all of those parts of our brain are just really firing up at the same time. What happens when all of these things are happening at the same time is our brain gets overwhelmed. And what happens with that is we go deep down into reptilian brain, which is the survival mode. Our brain shuts down at one point and we start thinking about how can I survive? How can I keep myself safe? And we go into this main when we are, which is what we call activated, which means that every experience that come our way, we don't really react to them in a way that we have learned how to react. And this is one of the things that makes being an immigrant and a refugee so different than everybody else's experience in this country. Because all of our brain is activated, all of our brain is working overtime. And when that happens, we go into this place where we are like, this is survival. So we really forget how to think logically. We don't know how to form relationships right away. And then we go into, I just need to survive at this moment. So I have a really quick example of this. I will go into this picture in a second, which you'll probably wonder why it's there. But what happens when we immigrate into a different country is our threat response system gets activated. And what that means is every time that there is an event that happens, in our lives, at the very beginning, even at this moment, as I am talking to you, our brain, our experience, we are in the process of experiencing and what we call exploratory orienting. So we're sitting here, I can feel the chair I'm sitting in. I can feel the warmth of the sun coming from my window. I can see all of these beautiful lineup markers that my daughter has in her room. So exploratory orienting is us being in a position where we know what is happening. This is my home, so this feels comfortable to me. Now, when we are in our countries, we're consistently orienting ourselves. There is smells, there is sounds, there is things that we feel. All of those things our brain is able to process. All of a sudden we move here and we realize that things are different here. And when that happens, there is a stimulus that happens that shocks our brain a little bit, and we go like, wait, something here is not right. People here don't hug. People here don't kiss each other on the cheek twice. That stimulus usually stops us. And what happens with that is we usually have a response of like, wait, what? Which is our startle response. And then when that happens, we go into 4 different things. We either fight, which is we get really angry. We flight, that means we go back. We freeze, which is like, I don't even know how to function here. Or we engage with a community. Now, as we are talking about mental health, one of the things that happen is when we are in a typical environment, when we are in our countries and we are trying to understand where we're from, we know how to do this exploratory orienting. We know what to do when something is not right and something comes out of nowhere. We know how to react to it, and we know how to organize ourselves again to be able to ground ourselves and then have that moment of discharge. That moment of discharge is after something happened to us. We have that moment when we go like, oh, man, that's scary. What we know is, specifically for our community, is when we go through all of this process, our brain is created to go through all of this process. However, because we are in a totally different environment, because we don't really know how some of the nuances of this country impact our everyday situations, what happens is that moment that is so necessary for our brain to calm down, that is that discharge of, okay, I'm safe, I can do this. And then we start the cycle all over again. That moment hardly ever happens. And that is what there is so many mental health issues happening into our community. So I have a very quick example of how that happens. And that's my wonderful picture here. So before the chat that happened and before all of this happened with COVID, which is another huge impact into now everyday's life. We were out and about, we were coming home, and then my husband said, you know what, let's go ahead and do grilling. And I said, well, it's already 4 o'clock, it's gonna get dark outside. And he's like, oh, it's okay, I can do it. So we come home, it's around 5 o'clock, it's right about February. It's one of those days which is almost warm, but not warm enough. So I forgot something in the store, so he leaves me. And in my house, he does most of the grilling. I do the cooking, he does the grilling. And as I am preparing, all of this, he leaves, and I said, you know what, I'm going to be an amazing wife. One of those days when you're feeling I got it going on, I can do this. I'm going to turn on the grill. So I go outside, I open the grill. As I am opening the grill, there is this beautiful round set of leaves that when you open the leaf has the lid on it. And I thought, well, that's strange. Then I was at the top of my game at that time. My prefrontal cortex and logical thinking was totally activated. I'm like, he always gets angry when I throw the leaves into the deck. So I said, you know what? I'm going to put the leaves in the bag. And he's going, so proud of me. So I went and got a paper bag, and I came in. I'm putting all of these leaves in. As I put my hands in there and I'm sticking, I feel the crunchiness, I feel the smell of the leaves. And I'm like totally focused on this process. All of a sudden, I feel like, something is moving in here. Not only that, but there's something bony that is in there, and it feels really strange in my hands. As I am processing all of this, all of a sudden I realize, oh my God, there is something in here. And I see this squirrel jump out of there. It turns out to be a nest. I had no idea that could happen. Again, I didn't grow up in a country where there were squirrels. And my response after that, which is what I think relates to this, is I was dysregulated. I couldn't think logically. There was no memories or nothing that could happen at that point that can calm myself. I went in survival mode. In my house, my husband doesn't speak Spanish. My kids are bilingual, but everybody else around me does not speak Spanish. All of a sudden, I started screaming around my house, and I am running and saying, la ardilla, me tocó la ardilla, the squirrel has touched me, la ardilla. I am totally dysregulated. I'm running around. There's nothing that can, I mean, I went into flight. I went into flight. I did not do any freeze. I was touching myself everywhere. I am, at that point, I am crying. I see my kids coming out, I assume to help me, but no, they're coming out with their phones to record the crazy mom running around, which was totally devastating at that point. So I run myself in the house. I leave my kids outside in the deck. I lock myself because this squirrel is up to get me. I go upstairs, I shower myself. I am so dysregulated that there is nothing that I didn't really care where my kids were at that point. There was really nothing that I can do to calm myself down. And I think that's one of the parts, that's when I understood what happens with people when they come into this country and something traumatic happens. What happens is we forget everything that we have learned. We don't really have any skills to survive this. And unless we have a system in place that can help us move forward, and we have community, mental health issues become more stronger. Of course, after 20 minutes to an hour, I was able to regulate myself, and my husband came, and then he hugged me and he cared for me, and then everything was okay. My kids keep making fun of me, but that's another story for another time. One of the things that I want to mention is our beautiful brain has created and has given us the opportunity to have skills that prepare us to face adversity, to face stressful situations, to face traumatic situations. However, when that moment of discharge, that moment of the moment that happened to me an hour later, when my husband came in and I was in my safe environment happened, what happens with that is the way that we see the world changes. So our reactions change depending on when the situation happened. It depends on our chronological age, on our developmental age. Sometimes when something happens and we have no control over it, the symptoms might appear immediately. It might appear days later, weeks later. Our responses will differ from that depending on how supportive of an environment we have. What we know for sure 100% is without intervention, the symptoms will always get worse and mental health issues will become bigger and bigger. So we know that early intervention, that means reaching out and having resources that can help us, allows children, adults, adolescents to get back on that developmental path and be better. So I just want to mention and pass it up to Michelle that the important key here is to know our brain was created to face these situations. Mental health issues will worsen unless we come together as a community and find a way where we can provide the necessary resources for our community to get this. And I think this is why this cultural conversation is happening today. Andrea will be sending our presentation to everybody. So in there will be some of my information. If there is any more connections, I'll pass it up to my friend Michelle now.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm going to share my screen really quickly with you all. I love listening to you present, Rebecca. You have such a fantastic presentation style, and you're so engaging in how you share all these really important information. So thank you so very much. So as Andrea and Rebecca mentioned, my name is Michelle Bertuglia-Haley, and I work at Children's Mercy. I have a few disclaimers for you all today. And I so appreciate how Rebecca really set the tone for just some personal disclosures, right? To help understand the lens that she's coming at with the information. And so while I don't always share personal information about myself, I'm going to share some personal disclaimers as well. So I identify as she and her, and I am a non-immigrant. I have been working with the Latino and Hispanic community for about 20 years now, both internationally in other states in the United States, and then here locally in Kansas City. And I work really, really hard knowing that I am not an immigrant in this country, but having had experiences of knowing what it's like to live in other countries and to feel that isolation, to remember that in my daily work with our patients and families here at Children's Mercy, and to take that culturally humble stance and understanding that I don't understand. And how do I work with our patients and families to ask the right questions to better understand how we can help support our patients and families here at Children's Mercy. In my role here at Children's Mercy, I supervise a group of clinicians. I have the fantastic opportunity to provide evidence-based practice to children between the ages of 2 and 18. And then more recently, I've spent a lot more time working in our emergency department, helping do suicidal assessments for our patients and families here. So I feel like that Rebecca did such a fantastic job of really kind of lining up, right? Like culturally speaking, many times when our systems get overwhelmed, sometimes we're going to have negative reactions to that. And so I'm going to spend some time today with you all really kind of diving more deeply into the details around what we are seeing on both a national and local level in regards to when our systems become overwhelmed, and sort of how to identify and recognize signs and particular risk factors within immigrant and refugee populations, and then how we intervene just a little bit. So we're going to talk about signs of mental health crisis and suicidal behavior, understand the frequency through local, national, and global lens, recognize risk and protective factors, specifically within the Latinx community, and discuss prevention steps to use in immigrant and refugee populations, and then some tools for how we can help. So I always like to center myself with a story to kind of help illustrate a point or an idea. I want to share with you the story of Alejandra. Alejandra came here to Children's Mercy, to one of our primary care clinics at Broadway, and her parents had made an appointment for her, and it was just for a well child check. Well, in that well child check, Alejandra disclosed that she had recently been having suicidal ideations, unfortunately, and she disclosed that she had been through several incidences of sexual abuse that she hadn't really talked a whole lot about. So if we rewind just a little bit, I love Alejandra's story because I feel like it does such a beautiful job of just helping pinpoint the ways that prevention systems can work within a community. So Alejandra had been self-harming in school, and she told a friend, she said, I've been cutting lately, and a friend was really, really concerned about her. And so that friend did what needed to happen and told the counselor at school. The counselor then called mom and dad. And it's important to note that Alejandra's mom is an Indigenous woman. She identifies in the Indigenous community from Mexico, and her dad is non-Indigenous Mexican. But, so the school counselor called mom and dad. Mom and dad that day, dad came home early from work that day, which very rarely happened within the family. And they had like her madrina there and her padrino there, and all the adults were there, right? To say, Alejandra, what is going on? Like, we are so worried about you. And that was the first time that Alejandra told her parents her story about her experiences of sexual abuse and how she had been holding and carrying this for such a long time. And in that kind of family moment, her madrina shared with her, you know what, that happened to me too. And we don't want these things to happen to you. And so from there, they knew we need to get Alejandra more help. And so they made an appointment for her to be seen at Children's Mercy at our well child and have a well child check done here, where in talking with a social worker, they were able to identify, wow, we need to get her some more help and support. And so she was then referred to our team for us to be able to do trauma-focused CBT with her and her family. So we're going to talk a little bit more about Alejandra as we kind of go through our time today. So there's this mantra in a modality that I'm learning, and the modality is child-parent psychotherapy. And there's this mantra that states, don't seek to change what we do not first understand. I try to hold on to this so very, very much, because I think that as a non-immigrant, non-refugee woman working in this field, it's really important for me and for us to slow down and to really understand, or seek to understand, what are the challenges that our patients and families are experiencing, especially when they get to the point of showing up here at Children's Mercy in mental health crisis. So I want to share with you all just a little bit of education about sort of, as about the range of suicidal behaviors, and just give you some really good context. There's a lot of different ways that we talk about this, but I think if we slow down and sort of talk about some of these definitions and also some of the rate and the prevalence, it helps us have a better understanding as to why we're continuing to see these increases within our community. So as I mentioned, there's really a range of suicidal behaviors that we're paying attention to. So that first one is an attempt. If someone discloses that they have, harmed themselves with some intent to die, then we take that really, really seriously. And we know that if someone has one suicide attempt and they're unsuccessful, that there's a high probability that they may have additional attempts. And so we take that very, very seriously. Self-injurious behaviors, someone may be harming themselves, right? But they may not have any intent to die. They may just be doing it like Alejandra was, to help release, as I think Rebecca did such a beautiful job, some of that tension that's being held in their body and their system. And so they're looking for a way to release it. And so they may engage in self-injurious behaviors to do that, which we know is an unhealthy coping mechanism. There's ideation. So there's a range of different ideations out there. Somebody may have passive thoughts about not wanting to be here anymore, or they may have really active thoughts about not wanting to be here anymore. And the really important thing for us to think about when we hear that someone has a suicidal ideation is, what level are they within these ideations? Have they made a plan? Do they have access to the means? And that really drives where we're going to intervene and how we're going to help intervene. And then obviously we have death, right? Somebody who is able to complete a suicide attempt, which we never like to see, and need to continue to work to help intervene so we see fewer deaths by suicide. So I want to share with you some context about how this looks within our community here. So here in Kansas and Missouri, hang on, let me get my notes really quick because I don't want to get this wrong. So as you can see, the rates are increasing pretty steadily and have been increasing pretty steadily for quite some time. The rate in Kansas in 2018 was 19.5 deaths per 100,000 people. And in Missouri, it was 21 deaths per 100,000 people. We saw a rate in Kansas really specifically increase from 41% between 2009 and 2018. So as you can see in 2009, way down here, it was at about 13.8 and it got up to 19.5 here in 2018. So we're seeing, unfortunately, these trends are really on the rise currently. And kind of, oops, sorry, I went the wrong way. And looking at our national statistics, this kind of helped me ground just a little bit too and say, well, where are we compared to other places in the US? So if you look over here at state rankings, currently New Jersey has the lowest rate of suicide deaths, and Wyoming has one of the highest rates of suicide deaths. And I think that I've heard some things like access to means and access to firearms is something that contributes to those higher rates in some of those other states. As you can see, Kansas and Missouri, we really fall about right in the middle in terms of our deaths by suicide within the country. And we're on this 18 to 21, like we're right in here, which is obviously much higher than we want to be, but it's kind of currently where we fall. As we see, that suicide is the second cause of death in the United States between youth between the ages of 10 and 24 years old. And internationally, it's the #1 cause of death among adolescent girls, according to the WHO. So as you can see, there's these, it's a really prevalent within 10 to 35, and then we see things shift a little bit, right, between 35 and 44, and then again at 55 to 64. So I spent some time really just trying to understand globally what things look like as well, and how do we think about this on a global scale. So, unfortunately, 800,000 individuals die by suicide each year globally, and it's about one person every 40 seconds. The global death by suicide rate is lower than our current rate here in Kansas and Missouri, and it's at 11.5. And it is the second leading cause of death worldwide for youth between the ages of 15 and 29. And we see that low and middle income countries have a suicide rate of about 11.9 per 100,000, and that most displaced and refugee populations live in low and middle income countries and represent about 75% of suicide deaths worldwide. These are gruesome statistics, and I think that it's really hard to hear, but I think it's really important that we're talking about it and that we have a factual base to understand what does this look like, and then it helps us figure out what we need to start doing differently. So back in 2017, the CDC did a risky behavior in youth assessment survey. And, what they found was that, of the folks that they interviewed, 17.2% responded that they had seriously considered suicide. So that's even higher, obviously, than our suicide rate. 13.6 had a plan for how they would complete, 7.4 had attempted, and less than 3% had spoken with a medical provider about their suicidal ideation. So I think that really demonstrates we have an opportunity here as folks who work in the community, as folks who work in different agency settings, to really be assessing for these things with our patients and families. So here in the United States, risk factors for all populations include if you've had a previous suicide attempt, consumption of drugs and alcohol, a diagnosis of depression and anxiety, and then your access to lethal means. The thing I want to say about consumption of drugs and alcohol is that, as we know, when we're using substances, it really decreases our ability to make logical decisions. And so sometimes, what we know is that suicidal ideations, when our body is just so incredibly overwhelmed by the stress or the factors that are impacting us, these thoughts may come in waves. And if we are impulsive, if our brains aren't functioning at that full place, as Dr. Chow had spoken about, it can really increase the risk. And so that's why it's so important for us to pay attention to these things. So, and kind of looking at and thinking about what are the specific suicide risk factors for refugee and migrant populations. Rebecca mentioned these, right? Displacement from that home country. I love how Rebecca shared our bodies are built for a certain cultural context. And when we are removed from that cultural context, it has an impact on us and how we function. I think about socioeconomic stress too. When I had the opportunity to live in another country, I was working for the US government. And so I had all the support in the world to be able to help me. And it was still really hard. But we know so many of our immigrant and refugee families, they don't have that support and help. Or if they do, it's short term. And then they need to be able to be self-sufficient very, very quickly and dealing with acculturation stress. As we also previously mentioned, exposure to traumatic events and things that might have happened before folks came, maybe in their way to coming, or maybe once they got here. Prior mental health disorders, and then there's an absolute lack of appropriate and accessible care, specifically within our population's native languages. We know that has a big impact. The other thing that isn't on here, but I'm going to talk a little bit about within the Latinx population, is discrimination, right? So that is another incredibly huge stressor that impacts folks once they come here. Their experiences of how they're seen in this world or this community absolutely impacts, the stress and how folks may be feeling. I think too, there are other, just like cultural factors to really consider. So I think a lot about this in maybe there's like survivor guilt too, which could impact folks as they are in a new country. So, I'm lucky. I got to come here. I shouldn't be feeling this way, right? I have other people back in my home country who don't have the opportunities that I have. And so there may be some survivor guilt about even having any challenging need or support for mental health disorders when you are here, or some of these stressors. I think about too this cultural factor of maybe it's not something that's talked about within the culture at all. You are not allowed to say how you're really feeling, or that you're having these thoughts. And so those internal coping mechanisms that we have to just keep going sometimes I think can be present. And then I also think that there's sometimes shame, right? Like, what is wrong with me? I am so weak to have these feelings. That's not okay. I've been through so much. Why is this happening to me now? So I think about, some of these things compiling onto the stressors that so many of our refugee and migrant families are already facing. So there's research out there, there's an increasing body of research out there just about suicidal risk factors for Latinx adolescents. Some of the current risk factors that we're seeing is use of alcohol, less access and utilization of mental health services. We know oftentimes both within the Hispanic or Latino community and other communities as well, it's super taboo to go get mental health treatment. Or, I'm currently working with somebody here at Children's Mercy to continue my cultural understanding and growth. And he shares with me oftentimes with my coach, he's like, Michelle, like only really rich people get to do this in other countries. Like you have to remember that. This is something that is very, very foreign around the world. And so to reach out and say that I need help can be a much bigger step for many of the families that we're working with than it maybe is for us here. That feeling of alienation, people don't understand me, or I'm alone here, that my support systems that I had in my country of origin are not here with me, acculturation stress and family conflict. So Rebecca mentioned this a little bit, but thinking about working with families that are multi-generational and where they are in terms of their acculturation, right? So we've got, as I mentioned, with Alejandra's family, her mom, was identified as Indigenous Latina, and the way that her experiences were incredibly different than Dad's experiences growing up. And now they're raising these, 2-3 children here in the United States who, are trying to ground themselves in who they are culturally, but also they live in a community where there's not a lot of other Hispanic youth. And so those conflicts that can arise living in a multicultural home can have impact, I think. Sometimes feeling hopeless, prior diagnosis of mood disorders, legal status, as we have seen over these past 4 years, and even prior to that, our youth not knowing maybe what their futures are going to look like and how just scary that is for them as they're moving forward is really important. As I mentioned, discrimination. I'm currently working with someone right now, and she was bullied from the ages of, I guess, probably 10 to 15, pretty significantly. And she felt like it was because, again, she was a lone Latina in a community, in her school community. And so kids really, really picked on her. And that's had a really tremendous effect on just her growth and development, and how she's feeling and coping with things. And then, as we mentioned, with witnessing violence and traumatic stress, right, can all be risk factors here. So just kind of looking at a larger panorama, I think it's important to know that, like, historically, and looking at the research and the literature, that Hispanic youth have had a lower suicide rate than other groups within the United States. But unfortunately, these numbers have been on the rise steadily since 2000. And I think the important context within that is that they've also been on the rise for other groups as well, right? But it's important that we do notice that. According to the Youth Risk Assessment conducted by the CDC, 10.5% of Latinas between the ages of 10 to 24 have attempted suicide in the last year. So I think that there is, an increasing body of literature and research that's showing that sometimes that role of being, again, that first generation, right, youth in a family, and some of the cultural stressors that are on those young girls can have an impact on how they're feeling, right, and what's happening with them. And we see that, unfortunately, Latinx youth are at a higher risk for depression and suicide compared to other ethnic groups in the United States. So let's talk about some positive things. Let's talk about there are factors that help prevent suicide risk that are fantastic. So that first one is, many of us, I think, who work within the Latino community are really struck by just the important role of family and family systems within the community. And, we know, and there's research demonstrating that, when youth are feel cared for and supported by family members in their family, and they can, just like Alejandra did, she was able to come to her parents, she was able to tell them what was going on, and then they responded in the way that was most helpful for her. That is preventative right there. That connection to family and the importance of being a part of a family in a larger cultural system is absolutely a preventative factor that has been shown. Another fantastic preventative factor is ethnic affiliation. So having pride in your heritage and being connected to groups, whether, oftentimes I hear about young Latinas who are part of, their church where they're maybe doing cultural dance, and having an understanding of that, or being connected to places like Maddie Rhodes and other, fantastic community organizations that absolutely provide context for culture and pride around culture and understanding around culture. And through having that context, that can absolutely help youth feel like they're a part of something, right? And feel like that they belong somewhere. Another piece is religion. We know in many Christian religions, it's seen as a sin, or a pretty grave sin, to take your own life. And so sometimes being involved in religious groups sometimes can just help mitigate that and help folks look for other coping mechanisms. And then what we see across the board is having those supportive adults in your life, right? Other relationships besides your caregivers, teachers, other adults to be able to talk to can be an absolute preventative factor. So in looking at more migrant and refugee populations prevention, I had an opportunity to really look into, what does the WHO recommend when it comes to prevention within displaced populations? And if you're working with displaced populations, I would highly recommend that you go to the WHO website. And I've got a slide on the end of this that kind of takes you right there. And they talk about what is evidence demonstrating to be the best level of intervention within refugee and migrant populations. And I think that, obviously there's not been enough study on this, but the WHO is taking this as a priority area and working to help inform what are the tiered levels of intervention that we need to do, and how do we, within a cultural framework that is appropriate for the group that we're working with, help build in the right systems to help support opportunities to talk about some of these things. So some of the recommendations in, what the WHO states is that, obviously reducing means, and we're going to talk about that here in just a minute, using social media to report in a responsible way. We know that across the world, media is used differently, but if there's the possibility to report about suicidality and risks in a responsible way, that can help provide opportunities to be able to talk about it. School-based interventions in countries where maybe there's not policies around alcohol use, providing some policies around that. Early identification and treatment, training of non-specialized healthcare workers in the assessment and management of suicidal behavior, and then follow-up care for people who've attempted suicide, and then provision of community support. So what can you do? How can you help in your setting and where you are right now? we know that prevention is incredibly, incredibly important. We know that through family, school, community, when we are able to utilize similar tools to be able to help assess risk and then help support getting folks who identify at risk to a place where they can receive the help, that is tremendous, because that is what can help on every level. So I love these myths and facts. I think they're really grounding and really important to talk about. So this first myth, asking a depressed person about suicide may put the idea in their heads. This is absolutely a myth. You know, I think that even as a mental health clinician, it's been hard for me to learn how to speak very directly with people about their suicidal ideations, but it's been incredibly important. I think that it's hard because we want to be culturally appropriate and we want to be culturally sensitive, but it's really important that sometimes we're just incredibly frank about what someone is sharing with us. A lot of times, folks, when they are having feelings of not wanting to be here anymore, they may absolutely use passive language with us, right? And it's important for us as people who work within the community to pick up on some of that passive language and then use cultural humility to dig a little deeper and figure out what they're trying to say. I will never forget the first time that I assessed a mother who was 25 years old. She was an immigrant from Honduras. She was very alone. And we were in our therapy session together, and she was using really passive statements of just like, I don't want to be here. Or it wasn't even that. It was, I just don't know. I don't know if things are worth it. I'm not sure. And she was very, very passive. And so I knew I had to get in a little bit deeper and just say to her, hey, are you having thoughts of taking your own life? And she said, yes, I absolutely am. And she then shared in a way that was probably uncomfortable for her, right? Like, yeah, I can't guarantee that I'm going to keep myself safe walking out of here today. And I said, okay, we're going to help support you and take the steps that we need to take to help you. But we're not all comfortable with asking those direct questions, but it's really important if we're picking up on passive language to go in and ask those direct questions, because we are not going to put the idea in someone's head. It's already there. And so oftentimes when I'm working with youth here at the Children's Mercy emergency departments, they'll just be straight up with you, you know, yep, I'm having these thoughts. Yep, I don't want to be here anymore. And then we're able to kind of figure out what we need to do from there. The other question is, or the other myth is, there's no point in asking about suicidal thoughts. If someone's going to do it, they won't tell you. I also find this to be absolutely not true. When we go in and when we ask the questions, so oftentimes people are incredibly honest and candid with you about how they're feeling. And when they are honest, or if they're using these passive statements and we can drill in just a little bit more, we're able to figure out what level of intervention. And then that third myth, someone that makes suicidal threats won't really do it. They're just looking for attention. And, you know, I think that what's important about that is that we are not in a place in our community, in our country, in our world to not take these threats seriously. And we don't have to know what the next steps are. We don't have to be the one to further assess them, but we absolutely have to get them to that next level of help so that they can be correctly assessed, so that we can make sure that they're able to be safe, or as in with the case of Alejandra, that we can get the right things in place to help support them so they no longer have these suicidal ideations. So how do I get help for somebody that I know who maybe is having, you know, suicidal thoughts or ideations? First off, if you notice someone is sad or depressed, talk with them about what you're noticing. Again, I know that culturally it may not feel like the right move, but we have a responsibility to talk with folks about this and make sure they're getting the right levels of care. And also partnering with community groups and agencies where we know that if they need a higher level of care support, that we can feel confident in helping support them get to that next step. Believe them. If they say they don't want to live any longer, take it seriously. And then finally, get them some medical attention, right? Help support them getting to the next step of getting some medical attention. So just really quick, I know my time is up, but you know, one thing that we talk a lot about with our patients and families here is reducing access to means. So, you know, we see that when we're able to reduce access to means, that can be a pretty significant intervention within itself. So does that person who's having these thoughts have access to firearms? It's an uncomfortable question, but an important question for us to ask. Are their medications locked up? Do they have access to sharp objects? Do they have access to ropes and cords? What does supervision look like? And how do we do some safety planning with them? And these are all things that a mental health professional would be able to help support someone with. But as somebody working in the community, you know, you can check in with them. Hey, I want to make sure we're following your safety plan, or can I see your safety plan so that we can support you together? So finally, I just want to close with Alejandra's story. So after Alejandra, you know, disclosed, I think that what was so fantastic about her being so brave and sharing what she shared is that we got to see how all those levels of intervention worked to help keep her safe, right? She told a friend who told a teacher who told her parents. Her family showed up for her, right? Who got her some medical help and support. And then she was able to get mental health services here, and she was able to work through her trauma, and she was able to get the support of some medications to help decrease her feelings of depression. And today, Alejandra is doing fantastic. Her caregivers really recognized, like, whoa, we need to step up our game. And they were very collaborative in ways that we could help better support her. Now she's dancing on a competitive dance team, and she's doing fantastic in school, and she has control over her narrative, which is really different than how she felt before. And so I feel like it's just such a beautiful example of how, when we have the right supports in place, we can get our patients and families and community to the right place, there really is that opportunity for healing. Okay, so I've got just a couple of resources here, and I think Andrea is going to share out our slides, but I cannot understate how much the Suicide Prevention Lifeline website is just a very rich resource with tons of fantastic information. And then, as I shared earlier too, the WHO's information about sort of really recognizing suicide on an international level with very specifically migrant and refugee populations is really fantastic, and they've got some great tools as well. Thank you so much, and I'm going to hand it over to Andrea.
All right. Thank you, Michelle, for sharing that information with us. That's very helpful. And also thank you, Dr. Chow, for providing an overview of just mental health and the trauma responses and what that cycle looks like. I think, you know, as we are having Dr. Chow and Michelle talk to us about more of the overall mental health aspects to look at and how suicidality is so important, I think it just reminds us all of a couple of different things, that mental health is just as important as health in general. It is a part of being a healthy individual. And so you can't talk about one without talking about the other. And which brings us nicely into our next portion of our presentation, where one of the things that Dr. Chow and Michelle had shared with us is that we need to be talking about mental health. We need to be discussing this and not afraid to bring it up with the individuals that we come across. And if we're noticing that somebody is acting a little bit different than maybe they usually do, we need to be prepared as those of you who are on this call with us today, as community health workers, as social service providers. We're needing to be able to feel comfortable with asking and having that discussion, which then this portion that we're going to move into, we're going to have Adriana Pesina and Oscar share with us a little bit about a journey that they have been walking through and discuss some cultural aspects that have been helpful for them through this process, and how Oscar really came into Adriana's life at the right time, and really kind of highlight some of these things that Michelle and Dr. Chow have been talking to us about. So just to give everybody a little bit of an update, we will have Adriana and Oscar present to us about more of the Latino perspective and experiences that Adriana has had that will really, I think, help for those of us on this webinar today, have some tangible understanding of when we're working with our participants, patients, clients, of how we can connect with them in a different way. And then we will pass it over to Suhir, who is from Truman Medical Center, one of the cultural health navigators, who will share with us more of a refugee perspective. And so I am very grateful for our following panelists that are going to share with us their stories. So with that, I will turn it over to Adriana Pesina, who is the Senior Program Officer of the Health Forward Foundation. Adriana, thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing your story and helping us to understand a little bit more about how we can be supportive of those of us in our community that might be dealing with suicidality, mental health situations that we can definitely support them with. Thank you, Adriana.
I guess I should unmute myself first. Thank you so much, Andrea. It's an honor to be part of this session today. I do want to start off by sharing with you that I am an immigrant. I was born in Mexico City, raised in Kansas City's West Side since the age of 2. So I grew up very bicultural, bilingual, visited Mexico every year for my family's Christmas gatherings. So I have 4 children, and my second child, Ucielito, we lost to suicide 4 years ago. My children have been raised bilingual and bicultural, very much in diverse settings. They went to Kansas City Public Schools, and my son Ucielito, at the age of 17, graduated from high school with honors. He was the most accomplished young man. He had a love for sports and excelled in sports, excelled in music, excelled in everything he put his mind on. He was incredible. When he was young, he knew he wanted to be a soldier at some point. He admired his grandfather who served in the Marines and his father who served in the Army National Guard. And he always said from the time he was young, when he played with GI Joes, that he wanted to go to the military and serve his country. He was also an Eagle Scout. And I want to clarify this to say that, you know, you would think a family, middle-class family, my husband and I are immigrants, grew up in the US, have benefited from so many programs and a community that was there to support us, like the West Side and all the programs that it offers. But never once did we ever talk about the term suicide or ever talked about mental health, either one-on-one or in family settings or in a community setting. So 4 years ago, November 4th, 2016, and I saw that we became part of those statistics that Michelle shared earlier and the prominence and the increase in suicide. We never thought that our beloved Ucielito would take his life. He came back from boot camp, very different. I believe that his experience at boot camp and his specialty training exposed him to some ugly discrimination, possibly racism, bullying, a lot of what we heard from Dr. Chow and Michelle. We were not prepared. We just thought he needed some time to adjust, and that day did not come. You know, if we would have known that there were options out there to take him to get assessed, right? That we could actually take him to the ER and to get an assessment there. The other interesting thing is that he went to a pediatrician throughout his childhood. When you turn 18, you have to find a primary care physician. Well, we didn't have that time. So truly, here I am, a person with a master's degree. My husband has a doctorate degree. And we still didn't know the wherewithal. Where do we even begin? We noticed he was starting to shut down, spend too much time alone. He was starting to give things away. Some of his more valuable possessions, he was giving them to his cousins or his siblings. And we just found that very odd, but we kept waiting for that day to finally get him to adjust to the civilian life. That day did not come. But I will tell you that these past 4 years have been a true blessing. It's been very much a healing process. through this grief journey that we have had to go through, we've not only found all this information out that Michelle and Dr. Chow have shared, but we've also met wonderful people like Oscar through our grief journey. I work at the Health Forward Foundation. I know a lot about programs to help individuals and families to understand and to be, to participate in programs that will help them with mental health and grief. When we heard about Solace House, we entered into a program that was a support group, and it was so comforting that we had a person from our culture that spoke our language and understood our traditions and our belief systems. And Oscar was the co-lead of our group. Not only were we able to feel comfortable in that setting, because we've never participated in a grief support group, but thank God that our paths did cross. And so when Andrea asked me if I could be part of this panel, I said, I would love to. We have a purpose in life that we need to share our story to save lives. And I said, with only one condition, that I can invite Oscar, because I think it's important to talk about grief and the grief journey, because this pandemic has taught us that grief is now going to be more normal, right, and common than we ever believed. So, these last 4 years, it's been amazing how many people have come to us from our family friend network that have told us, I've dealt with that feeling. I know what it feels to want to take my life. I have been to the hospital because I try to take my life. It's amazing that we are starting to, really tear down that stigma that, there's so much that people don't want to admit that they've had these feelings. When we wrote our son's obituary, we made sure that it had the hotline, the suicide hotline phone number. And my parents and my in-laws were not happy. They were very much ashamed and upset that my husband and I publicly shared that our son died by suicide. I don't use the term committed because they don't commit anything. A person, that's a negative word. We use the word died by suicide. And I really don't even like to say that he died by suicide as much as I want to say he died from depression. His cause of death was depression and PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. We learned also that he masked a lot of his anxiety by keeping himself busy. He was busy all the time. He was an entrepreneur. I don't think he slept much because he was always active. And he also explored with alcohol in high school, alcohol and marijuana. So when you think about him going away to boot camp, you're no longer able to use alcohol and marijuana to cope, right? So I'm sure that added to his experience, the stress that he faced in the trauma that he was facing in his boot camp. Our journey has also helped us not only share our story publicly, but to help others understand that I'm a safe person to talk to about how you're feeling, that I can send you information. I can walk with you to the hospital, to the ER. I can meet you wherever you are. I have friends and family and strangers that have called us at any time of the day where they're saying, I'm feeling this way. Can you please talk to me? We'll talk on the phone. We'll meet at a park. I pick them up. We walked, out in the fresh air and breathe, and look up to the sun. And there's just a need in this community to feel connected, to feel safe, to talk about our mental health, our feelings, what's going through our minds. I'm not an expert. I will never say that I'm the expert on suicide, but I do know that connections are so important, and talking and sharing how one is feeling is so important. And to know that it can happen to anyone. This does not discriminate. It can be, it's touched too many lives, famous people, as well as, folks that are homeless, that, you know, it doesn't discriminate whatsoever. There should not be any shame. And it's important to understand the medical explanations that Dr. Chow explained so well, you know, how the brain works. In this journey, I also learned that there are so many resources out in the community. I'm lucky to work for an organization that funds many of these programs, but I also, in my personal journey, I had never utilized the Employee Assistance Program. That's a program that exists with most employers where you can get free counseling at no charge, up to 3 to 5 sessions. I never knew that there was this suicide hotline. Just yesterday, I heard that there is, they have a person that speaks Spanish in the suicide hotline. So you can call, and I've personally called that number. My family and friends have called that number, and they do a beautiful job in responding. I never knew you could just go to your doctor, call your doctor or your clinic and tell them I'm feeling this way. Many times it could be that you might be going through some hormonal changes. It could be more physical, that you know, and it's affecting your mental health, but the doctors are important to reach. And there are many, many more other resources that I'll make sure that we send to Andrea so that she can share with you all that are on this call. I'd like to turn it over to Oscar so that he can share more about the work that he's doing with grief support.
Thank you so much, Adriana, for sharing your story. First of all, for that courage, and for everyone here for all the work that they do to help these populations. So my name is Oscar Orozco. I'm a licensed master social worker, and I currently am a grief support specialist at Kansas City Hospice and Palliative Care. Grief, my journey in, in grief and working with the grief population started when I was in school with my bachelor's degree. I started that journey thinking grief meant that you have lost someone you loved has died. Very quickly, I found that grief encompasses much more than just a death. And we have been talking, and not everyone here has been talking about that in this presentation. We look at the immigrations of people and individuals who are coming here, and Dr. Chow and Michelle had touched on that. So when, you know, the trauma doesn't start when they get to the country. You know, the trauma and the grief has started before they even took the journey and the decision to make that journey here to the United States. You know, a lot of people, refugees, they're not leaving by choice. You know, they're not leaving because they say, I'm tired of living here, I gotta go. It's usually my life's in danger, I can't sustain my children, my family, and I need to find a better life. And so you think about the trauma is already starting there, the grief is already starting there. Individuals are losing that sense of home, that sense of tradition, of routine, of familiarity. You know, you grow up in a certain environment all your life. And as we talked about, when then you get it, you know, taken from you and you're placed in a foreign country. And then that country's expectations is, well, you should be grateful because you're safe now and your grades should be good and you should be able to work and you should be able to do X, Y, Z, and you just be grateful and, you know, get on board. And it's not realistic. It's not how we function as humans. Grief, as you know, we all know, has also been a very taboo topic. You know, we do not talk about it. It's hard to talk about that because it involves us going to a place of pain. And that's hard for people. Adriana mentioned, and I think it's very important, that sometimes what people do is that when we start to feel those emotions, we keep ourselves busy. You know, we say, oh no, I need to pick up this extra job, or I need to go out more, I need to pick up hobbies, or anything I can do to run away from the real issue, which is that grief or that trauma. And so it comes to it. So when I meet with individuals, it's not just, okay, well, what's going on, you know, right now? It's, you know, tell me what's been happening with you, not just right now, but, you know, months and years before we even, you know, cross paths. And a lot of grief work is a lot listening. As a profession where we want to help and we want to fix. Grief is not something that we fix. Grief is not something that goes away. You know, I tell people when we're working together, I'm not here to make your grief go away, but I'm here to help it make it more maybe manageable, to where, you know, it says one of the great metaphors that we use at Solace House and Kansas City Hospice is thinking of that grief as if you're in the ocean, right? And you see these waves coming at you and it's intense and it's hard for you sometimes to feel like you can keep breathing. You're struggling to just stay afloat. And so that's what mental health grief feels like, just intense waves of emotions. And sometimes people say, I can't do this. You know, when is this going to be easier? When is it going to go away? And I said, grief is a process that's different for everyone. You know, we might share similar losses, but our experiences and how we handle our grief is very different. Study and research actually shows that most people don't actually even need us as grief support. People tend to be really resilient. They have to have family members and community and religion or spirituality. And people tend to have the resilience to work through their own grief. However, when you add factors such as traumatic grief or trauma in general, then that grief becomes complicated. And complicated grief is different than just regular grief, because we're working with adding, on top of grief, you also have mental health factors to consider, you know, suicidality, depression, all that along with grief doesn't, you know, it adds more complications to it. So to be able to then say, okay, how do we have these conversations? You know, how do we talk about something that's so taboo? And really the thing, I always tell people, there's no easy way around it, but we must become comfortable with being uncomfortable. You know, having these conversations where, yeah, it might make us kind of move around in our chairs and be like, I don't really know how to ask this, but I'm going to anyway because I care about you. And that just that initial breakthrough of you realizing this change in someone, or realizing, hey, I've known you for X amount of time, or we worked together for this long, and I know that I'm noticing that something's not right, you know, and just extend that offer, you know that I'm here, or you know, these resources are available if you need me to help. Adriana is a shining example of that, of, you know, for us as mental health professionals, we can't reach everyone. You know, we can't be able to assess and talk with every individual in the community. But when we have individuals in the community, such as Adriana, who, you know, are not mental health professionals, but instead are just passionate about mental health and wanting to make a difference, then that's when we see just, you know, those resources explode, and that sense of community that we talked about. You know, sometimes people aren't comfortable or have that trust to come to the professionals, right? Especially in different cultures, especially when these are things that they're not comfortable talking about. So if we have that middle person like Adriana, who says, do you trust me? I can help and take you to these places that I trust or that I know, then that eliminates that barrier for us trying to reach those populations and those individuals who need our help. You know, and then once they come stepping through that door, then we can help that process of breaking down those barriers. Again, as they said, you all don't have to have that responsibility of, oh, I need to fix everything, or I need to be able to break and talk about grief. And no, it's just knowing where the resources are, knowing where to turn to when people ask for help, and being comfortable with being uncomfortable sometimes, because you're going to be placed in situations that you might not know what to do, that are crisis. But knowing, you know what, I'm not alone. I have a community behind me that I can call to, that I can turn to, and they can help me help these individuals. And so it's really a collective attempt to help the community. And so again, with grief, you know, being able to come on to like presentations such as this and just talk about it and say, you know, we can't escape grief, especially in the last year. It's undeniable. The resources for grief are going to be needed much more. And, you know, I'm blessed to be in a position that I can help doing that, you know, creating support groups, which I am, you know, huge fan of. And it's less me talking, but more allowing the individuals in the group to talk amongst each other, share resources, form bonds and relationships. Those are the protective factors. Those are what get people through that grief, to say, I'm not alone. And, I normalize that. Grief affects us not just emotionally, but physically. Our bodies take a toll. So when people always say, I feel like I'm going crazy, I hear that all the time. When a lot of people is like, I'm forgetting things. I'm not the person I was before the loss. And I'm the one that says, I understand, and that's normal. And it's not always going to feel that way. And I'm here to help you through that journey. And so that takes some of that pressure off people to say, okay, this is a very difficult journey, but it's not a journey that I have to go through alone. And so that protects the factors. So I don't want to take too much time from the other presenters, but definitely, I know it's just a very short spiel on grief, but it's something that's so very important. It's something that we need to continue to be talking about. And so definitely I will also share my information. And if anyone would like to continue these conversations about grief, it's something that affects all of us, and it also doesn't discriminate on where we were born or the color of our skin. It's something that we will all face, and it helps to know our resources for when that happens. So turn it back over to Andrea.
Thank you, Oscar. I appreciate you sharing that. And first, I want to say, Adriana, thank you so much for sharing your story about Uzielito. There was a comment made here on the webinar. It says, Uzielito will be forever remembered. And that is so true. And as you've said, he is continuing to save many lives. And I appreciate just what Oscar said, that your courage and your vulnerability to be able to share his story and what you have gone through with your own family, and how you have become such an important resource for many, many community members. And it's so good to hear that they can turn to you and have that support. So thank you for what you do. And also, Oscar, I think you brought home a couple of different very important points that for many of the individuals on this webinar, being community health workers and other social service providers, that the importance of being able to have that conversation and to be a champion in the community and sharing accurate information and talking about the myths and how the cultural aspects impact our family situations. So thank you, Oscar, for that and the work that you're doing at the grief supports. So next, we are going to turn this over to Suhir and Susan. Suhir is a cultural health navigator from Truman Medical Center that works with a lot of our families from Somalia. And we also have Susan with us, who is the Arabic cultural health navigator. And we are very excited to hear from them and the work that they're doing. They have a couple of different hats on each and every day when they are working with patients from Truman. And we are looking forward to hearing from them on how do they approach mental health conversations when they're working with families that are refugees. So with that, I'll turn it over to both of you. Suhir.
Thank you very much, Andrea. My name is Zuhur Hirai, and I am from Somalia. I've been with Truman 15 years as a medical interpreter, and the last 2 years I have been working as a cultural health navigator, as well as medical interpreter. So I myself, I am a refugee, came to this country 20 years ago, and most of our patients here that comes to Truman are refugees from Somalia with limited English, and also most of them are from nomads, that they have never had any basic educations. So mental health and depressions in refugees, especially in Somalia, it is a very hidden, I can say it's a forgotten field. Nobody really admits that they have a depression or they have any mental illness. So if I go back to your question, how do we approach patients that we feel that they have a mental illness? First of all, We do not ask any direct questions, as they can be sensitive or towards their mental status. But by working with them first day towards, the end of as they become familiar living condition in the United States, we can immediately tell, that they are afraid, scared, anxious, uh, because of the new country that they are in, the lack of the language, no support group, the weather, we don't have snow in Somalia, and so many things. So for me, coming here, being there in the refugee and coming to America, I can really relate to their needs from the beginning to the end. So we try to, the first step we do here at Truman, when I see that a person might seem depressed, I try to connect with making appointment with the primary care. For example, I have had a mother. She's here now almost 10 years. I remember the day they arrived here in Kansas City with their first son. I think their son was like 19, 20 years old. And he was the most active, the one who learned how to drive immediately. He was taking her around, bringing her appointments, both his mom and dad. And unfortunately, about 2 years ago, he was shot by robbers. He was he had his first baby 3 days prior to the day he died, and I was there. I was there to help him, interpret for birth certificate. And I remember chatting with him and his mother, and I was like, "Hey, now you can speak English." And he was telling me how he has a good job, and the mother was so happy to share with me that Dawood, his name was Dawood, how he is really learned the culture and everything and the language, and he is the hero for the family. He is the one who takes them to the hospital and everything. So that was Thursday, and Sunday I got the call from the community that he passed away last night by robbers. So you can imagine how that family particularly feel, having he was everything for them. So I personally, being an interpreter and cultural health navigator, I kind of took that family like my own family, even though I treat every family that comes to Truman like they are my parents. But still, that story touched me differently. I could remember weeks and weeks the conversation that I had with her son, three of us with the baby in the room laughing with each other. And then even for, I think I was kind of depressed myself. It affected me a little bit because I was in denial. I was like, no, I don't think he died. In my mind, I was having conflicting ideas. So the mother has my phone, and she she sends me blessings every morning in my phone. She records me on my WhatsApp. And that's how we touch bases with each other, how she's feeling. And lately she has been having headaches and body aches and crying spills and forgetfulness and all of that. And I know if I tell her directly, I think you are depressed, or I think you are, um, she will detach from me, because mental illness in our community, it's a stigma. Being depressed is like being crazy. So I didn't want to go there directly, but at the same time, I want to help her. So I told her, why don't you come? She was going to different clinic, and she was telling me how she doesn't have a support, like, somebody who can take her. Because I meet her at the door, and I walk her through to the appointment with the doctor. At the end of the appointment, with her appointment, with transportation. It is like
she didn't find that support in another clinic. So I was like, I will make you an appointment here at Truman. And some of the doctors that I really love dearly is I hook up with her. So she came 2 weeks ago for the appointment. I was so happy because sometimes they don't want to come to appointments. They will make all kind of excuses because they are feeling that loneliness, that separation. And I understand, but I do it with my cultural, the language. I understand the depression part, but I also understand the culture part. So I kind of try to maneuver in my own ways to bring her to the hospital. So she came. Here she is. I told her we have a new location, come through this. And I was waiting her in the door. We went to the appointment. As we were waiting, the doctor, she started talking about her son, and we cried together. And the doctor came, the doctor cried with us, when we share. And I think crying is a good thing. It makes you kind of talk, burn out all that toxin in your body. And at the end, we had a good plan. And the doctor was able to send her some tests. And we will just slowly, surely, I will try to approach her. And of course, if the doctor, also agrees that this is depression, we will explain to her how, yes, we treat depression by reading Quran. As a Muslim here, most of the refugees, they believe the faith part will take care of the depression by going to the mosque, or reading Quran, or being within the community. But at the same time, it is a journey that I will do it slowly with the doctor. And eventually, if she needs medication, because we have that trust. It is not building a trust is very important in this kind of context. You have to have somebody who is trusting you, what you do, somebody who feel that you love them regardless, somebody who doesn't have their job because they are doing, because they are gaining benefit. You have to do with compassion, with love. And once they realize, once you answer their phone 10:30 at night, 7 in the morning, and you are there for all the time, 24 hours, they will come to realize this person is not doing for money. Person is doing for love. And that's how we do, how we approach. The second question was, how do you reach families that are scared, worried to talk about mental health? And again, uh, mental health in refugees is completely a heading field and stigma. So just by making appointments with doctors. The other part that I really like and makes me happy at my work is postpartum depression. Many refugees, especially young mothers, because I came here, I have 4 kids, and I think one way or another, I kind of felt loneliness when I had, 4 C-sections with nobody, with no family around. So that is my other part, that when I see refugee woman, is, young woman who is scared, afraid, just had a baby, do not know the language, new to the country. Maybe she came 3 months ago. You can imagine how hard it is to make an appointment, to come to the doctor's, visit. We don't have this many doctor visits in Africa. People get pregnant and they deliver. That's all about it. Maybe 1 or 2 times. But here, sometimes if you are high risk, you would be there every week to be monitored. So I kind of, through my interpretation, I also do my consultation, teaching them how important it is to be monitored, how it is, why is it important to come, to see whether you have low fluid and all of that. So just by talking is how I touch my people and how I reach. And even though they have a faith, it's still we try to connect them with the doctors and medical fields. the other question, the third question was, how do you see mental health present with patients you work with? Um, my understanding that question was, I don't think my patients have any understanding of the language of mental health. Do you want to kill yourself? They will laugh at you. No, I'm a Muslim. How can I kill myself? Do you want to kill somebody? And then, is he crazy? So there is absolutely no understanding of that question because it is not in our Quran or our belief. So it doesn't make sense to them. And when I'm interpreting for them, I kind of, simplify for them, explain and tell them, yeah, maybe because of your faith, but there are a lot of people who feel hopeless. There are Muslims who commit suicide, even though suicide rate is very minimal and in the Muslim faith, because we believe that it is a bad sin, and if you take your own life, you will go to hell. But at the same time, uh, we cannot say people do not think about to take their own life, because I met a patient one time who came here, and he didn't have no apartment. He was single guy. He didn't have no apartment. He didn't know the language. He didn't had no insurance. I think they kind of worried that he had cancer, and he denied when the questionnaires were presented to him. He denied that he has suicidal thoughts. But as he get to know me, he told me, he said, I'm fed up in this country. I wish I can go back to Somalia. It is much better. Even though there is no enough food, I can talk to people in the street with my language. And it was so strange. As we were talking on the phone, he just said, I wish I can have access to these tall buildings, because I feel like climbing on top one of them and throwing myself from there. So from there, I knew, and I asked him, uh, if he wants me to connect with with the support, and they do not want, they will get angry at you. But I tried talking to him every day until I help him with the 2-month discount. And I talked to some of the community to find him a job. He moved away from the area where he was living. I guess he was living in Kansas City, Kansas, where there's no Somalians around. I gave him the options and just connected him with resources, and he's doing excellent. He is working, he is happy, and once in a while he calls me and he thanks me for what I did. So I think for the refugees, for Somali refugees, majority of their uh, depression comes from the separation, the war, the post-traumatic disorder that happened. Some of my patients, their parents were killed in front of them, and having a counselor who understands their language. I'm talking about not the language, the Somali language, but their belief systems is very important, because that's why they decline counseling, because that's that big gap of knowing the language of that person, not the Somali language, but what they went through. So they normally don't accept counselor, but I think Susan will add this to me. Here at Truman, we have a great team, and I can say I am a counselor, I'm an interpreter, I'm cultural health navigator. Uh, it's just so nice to be in this position, and I'm very thankful for my supervisor, because she is very helpful on that too, day-to-day life. And we have many stories within this short time. I don't think I can share with you one of the story. I mean, so many of the stories that I have, but it's just talking, connecting with the medical field, giving resources, giving example for myself. When I see young woman who is just stuck in her home, who wants to help her family, because for Somalians, one person could be in America, we have siblings that are more than 10. They might be back home, not having enough food, and they expecting you to support them. You can imagine how worried and how hopeless you are when you know that your mother is not having enough food, your siblings are not having shoes, they want to go to school, there is no enough education. You want to work, right? At the same time, you don't know how the daycare system works here. You are scared to leave your babies with a stranger. You don't know the language. You don't want to get out. That itself it's a depression. So I try to teach how I came out myself from that hole. I tell them, you know what? There is nothing wrong with leaving your child with a good certified daycare. I mean, if you cannot find a Somali babysitter, because I was lucky that I could find some Somali babysitters who can come to my home, or who can I take to my babies when my babies were little. But I told them, if you go on review and see that this daycare has a good reviews, if you feel comfortable to leave your child, the government sometimes help, to pay daycare, to go to school or to work. That way you can at least give 4 hours of yourself out, then you can feel that you are helping your family back home. It helped a lot of women. A lot of women took my journey, and they were able to come out from home, go to the daycare, go to babysitter, go to school, take some English classes so you can learn, you can go to the doctor without your husband being there. Sometimes they want to get away. They want to be, responsible. They want to drive by themselves. You want to go to a place not being, having an interpreter. You want to speak the language. So I kind of try to motivate them by giving my examples. And I'm so happy that a lot of women are doing better. And I tell them, there's nothing wrong with having your children in a good daycare. Look at my kids. They are functioning very well. So I think those are the three questions that were presented to us, and that's all about it.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Suhud, for sharing those examples and responding to the questions. I know that you and Susan worked closely together to get those answers, and it's just been very insightful to hear how, when you're working with patients there at Truman with your cultural navigator hat, the importance of having that compassion, but also being willing to share your story and what you've learned as a refugee that is getting acclimated to this new country. And I think that is what is powerful from hearing from you, Suhud, Susan, and Adriana about we are all in this together. The clinicians definitely, have an important role, but as Oscar said, clinicians cannot do this work, and nor should they be doing this work alone. This takes all of us. And that's why I am so grateful for all of our panelists today that are sharing their perspectives and how we can be champions. I don't want people to think, well, I'm not a clinician, I can't talk about this. That is absolutely not true. There's more momentum going on in the community. There's mental health first aid trainings. There's conversations like this that is helping us to understand that the importance of not being afraid to be uncomfortable and asking those questions of the community members, asking them if they're okay. That is all what is going to help us to move this needle forward and to work together. And I am just so appreciative for everybody sharing their story and their presentation this morning. And thank you to all of the attendees who have joined us this morning to hear these stories. And although we didn't have time for questions this morning, if you have any questions for any of our panelists, please feel free to send those my way. I'll put my name in the chat and email, and you can send those to me, and I'll make sure that the panelists get those, and we can make sure to respond with any answers. Again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this morning for this very important conversation. And the conversation will continue with all of us. So I hope everybody has a wonderful day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.